Nobody wanted the fish house. That was the whole reason he left it to her. At 70, Ada Somers sat in a lawyer's office off the county square that smelled of pipe smoke and river damp, and listened to a stranger read out the division of 30 years of her life. And when it was finished, her husband's son and daughter had the landing, the buildable waterfront, the crab house, and the workboats and the money. And Ada had a leaning fish house standing on its own pilings out over the marsh, a place the whole neck had called good for nothing but muskrats since before she married into it, and the old skiff hauled up in the mud beside it. Wade made a sound when she signed for it, a short breath through the nose that in a warmer man might have passed for a laugh, and in Wade was only arithmetic, the same quick figuring he did over a run-down crab house before he named the tear-down price. Donna studied the middle distance, and Ada, who had put Emory Somers to rest 9 days before and had not yet let herself weep where the family could keep a tally of it, folded her copy of the deed into her handbag and thanked them, quietly, for the ride down to the water. What none of them knew, not Wade, not Dana, not the watermen who shook their heads at the meanness of it, not Ada herself. Walking the marsh path that evening toward the rotting fish house the whole neck called good for nothing, was that under that caved roof, ranged on shelves in the loft, wrapped and waiting, stood the rarest thing anyone in that family had ever owned. Emory had spent 30 years putting it there. He had known to the foot what his son and daughter would take, and to the foot what they would never once trouble to cross the guts for, and he had made his wife's inheritance in the one place on the water he could be certain their good shoes would never go. This is the story of what Ada Somers found when she finally climbed the loft. It had been a small service, the way late October services are down on that end of the neck, where the marsh goes bronze, and the guts run silver, and the light comes thin and early off the water. Emory Somers was 84 when his heart quit on him at the carving bench, in the cold of the fish house, with a rigging knife still in his hand, and half the river's old rigs standing finished on the shelves above him. The little shore chapel filled with the people a man collects in a lifetime of mending things that float and things that fly, watermen whose grandfather's gunning rigs he had somehow brought back from a single battered bird, and women who had carried him a cracked old block off a back porch and could not say why it mattered so much that it be made whole again. Ada sat in the front pew between Emory's son and daughter, because that was where the undertaker placed her. Wade, 55, wore the blazer he wore to the marina closings. He had his father's heavy shoulders and none of his father's stillness. And he had spent 20 years turning tired waterfront into townhouses 2 counties wide. Dana, 52, had driven down from the suburbs and kept her sunglasses on inside the chapel. They were not cruel. Ada would have told you then. They were only 2 people who had decided, 30 years back, that the postmistress their father married in his 50s was a footnote that did not concern them. At the dinner, in the chapel basement, Ada heard Dana tell a cousin that at least the estate was a simple one. She said it the way you would say the tide had been fair. The will was read on the 2nd Thursday of November, in the office of J.T. Ricketts, who had drawn Emory Somers' papers for 40 years and did not smile that morning, though he looked at Ada more than once with an expression she was too worn down to open. The house and the home lot went to Wade and Dana, share and share alike. The landing, the deep water frontage a man could actually build on, the crab house and the workboats and the accounts, Wade and Dana. And then Ricketts cleared his throat and read the clause that made Wade sit forward, a man recognizing a joke a beat before he decides whether to be amused by it. To my wife, Ada, the old fish house standing out on the marsh point, the skiff beside it, and each and everything standing or stored upon that ground, of whatever kind and value, absolutely and without condition. That was the whole of it. No money. No foot of the buildable front. A fish house up on its own pilings out over the gut, its roof caved on the north side, condemned in every practical sense, sitting on ground the tax map could barely bring itself to call land, and the 2 of them chuckling among themselves in amused disbelief that the old man had left his widow a mud flat and a leaking shanty. Donna said, into the quiet, that Daddy always did keep his sense of humor to the end. Ricketts looked down at his papers and said the language was exactly as Mr. Somers had directed it, word for word, and that he had declined to soften a syllable of it, though the will had been redrawn as recently as 3 years back. Nobody asked what that meant. Ada signed where the little tabs pointed, and 30 years were done in half an hour, handed off like the wrong coat at the end of a supper. She could have fought it. The women of the Shore Chapel Circle told her so, in the gentle, relentless way of women who have watched too many widows go quietly. There was a widow's share, an elective right, a firm up in the county seat that did nothing else. Ada listened and thanked them and did not telephone the firm in the county seat. Some of it was pride, the narrow, load-bearing pride of a woman who had come to that marriage with a cedar chest and $40 in a Christmas club, and would not go out of it with her hand open. But under the pride was something steadier. Emory had written that will himself, in his own square hand at the kitchen table, and in 30 years the man had never once done a careless thing to her. He was a carver. A carver sights a block 100 times before the first cut, and never once mistakes the grain, and will spend a whole winter on a bird nobody asked for, because the bird is owed to somebody, whatever this was. And standing at the edge of the marsh that November, looking out at the black leaning shape of the fish house against a bruised sky, she could not for her life see what it was. It was not carelessness. She had a widow's benefit, a small pension off 30 years at the post office window, a paid-for car, and a fish house that grew nothing but tide. It would have to serve, because it was what he had left her, and she had decided on no evidence a lawyer would credit to trust him one more time. She had come back to the Neck in the spring of 1986 with a cedar chest and a hope she had been too old even then to say out loud. Ada Coyne, 40, 18 years gone up the county, keeping a post office window in a crossroads town. Coming home to keep the Neck's window when the old postmistress finally gave it up. Emory Somers, 54, 6 years a widower, keeping his fish house and his rigs and his son and his daughter, and a silence you could set the tides by. He courted her the way he did everything, slowly and without waste, and she had loved him for 30 years in that same economy of speech. His son and daughter never warmed, not with open cruelty, mostly, but with weather. Wade called her Ada in a tone that fixed, to the inch, the distance between Ada and mother, and the things she tried to send into that family. Years of Sunday dinners and put-up figs and a hand that would gladly have done more were received and thanked for and forgotten by the next season. A woman who has kept a public window for 30 years learns early that you hand the stamp across and let people carry it off wherever they will, or you go bitter, and Ada had made her choice a long time ago. What she did not know, all those years among people who talked around her, was that one man at the table had been keeping the account. Emory never said. Emory, she would come to understand, believed that saying was cheap, and that keeping was the only proof that counted. The fish house was older than the marriage, older than the paved road down the Neck. Emory's grandfather had driven its pilings into the marsh point in 1921, when every waterman on the river gunned his own rig in the fall and carved his own birds by lamplight through the winter, and the trade had gone out around it slowly, the way a tide runs off a flat, as the packing houses closed and the young went up the county for work, and the water gave less every year, until Emory was the last man on that river who could take a battered old block off a failing rig and carve the whole thing living again. From the landing, the fish house looked exactly like what the Neck said it was. A gray-board shanty up on leaning pilings out over the gut, its shed roof caved on the north side, marsh grass grown up through the walk, a skiff hauled into the mud beside it, with a garboard the color of an old fence rail. Muskrat ground, Wade had called it at the crab house, and standing at the foot of the walk that first cold morning with a bailing scoop in her hand and the low sun coming level off the water, Ada could not honestly have argued the point. But it was quiet out there, quiet the way the slack of the tide is quiet, and it smelled of tar and cut cedar and cold salt, of seasons, and it did not once look at her with pity, which was more than she could say for the chapel basement. Cole, Wade's boy, 28, the one Somers who had ever sat at Ada's kitchen table without being sent to fetch something, and who ran a workboat now and taught rigging 2 mornings a week at the community college down the shore, carried her cedar chest out the marsh walk, holding it against him the way you carry a thing you mean to keep. He was angrier than Ada let herself be. She told him to mind the soft plank by the door, and set the scoop to the water standing in the bilge of the lower room, and began. The lower room of the fish house had a carving bench Emory had kept, a cot, and a little sheet iron stove for the long fall nights, when a run of weather kept a man off the water, and he might as well make a bird. It had not been given a proper cleaning, from the look of it, in 20 years. They worked 2 days getting it fit to stand in, carried out the rotted netting and the swollen crab pot lumber, blacked the stove, tacked plastic over the window that faced the gut. Along a shelf on the landward wall stood a row of old wooden birds gone gray with dust, a dozen or so, their paint checked and lifting, the last he had set out there. Ada moved them aside to sweep and thought nothing of it. A ladder in the corner went up through a square hole to the loft under the caved roof, and she did not climb it that week. There was water in the bilge and a stove to black and a life to take apart into boxes, and the loft could keep. When they were done, Cole stood in the doorway looking out over the marsh in the last of the light and asked what on earth she meant to do with all of it. Ada looked a long moment at the leaning old shanty and the mud and the skiff. "Bail it out," she said. "Finally, it is mine now. I would like to know what is up under that roof." She went at it the way she had broken every hard season of her life, which was the way she did everything, a little at a time, one scoop of the bilge, one armload of rotted net, until the impossible corner stopped being impossible and became a thing the hands simply knew. The watermen slowed their skiffs in the gut to watch the widow bail out her insult, and some of them lifted a hand. She learned later that Wade had told a table at the crab house that the old girl was welcome to every rotten plank of it, and that the kindest thing said in reply was nothing at all. The first strange thing was the church rig. A man named Vernon Teague, who had carried the mailboat up the river for 40 years and had a face like a split cedar rail, tied up at the fish house walk one December morning to tell her that if she ever meant to sell the old sink box out of the loft, he would give her a fair price for it, and, while he was standing there, said the other thing. Somebody had been keeping the old rigs alive, he said. All these years. The families down the river thought their grandfather's birds had just gone the way of everything, sold off or split up or lost in a shed fire, but the truth was, Emory had gone quiet down the river the first slack week of every winter for 30 years, in every kind of weather, to find the one bird left off a failing family's rig and carve the whole thing back, and had never taken $1, and had asked Vernon, more than once, not to make a talk of it. And it was not only the one family. Any time a rig went to pieces up any gut on that river, Vernon said, a family might come out some spring to find a fresh carved bird set on the shelf where the old one had rotted, and no note, and no bill, and they mostly never knew who to thank. Otto stood in the cold off the water after his mailboat had gone, looking out over a marsh where a whole river's worth of somebody's birds still rode the fall flights for anybody who kept a blind, and felt something turn over slowly under her ribs, like the first push of a flood tide up a gut that has lain flat and empty all through the bottom of the ebb. Emory had been keeping the river's rigs for 30 years, unpaid, unmentioned. He had gone down the guts to carve living birds off failing ones, so that no family on that water would ever come out on a fall morning to a rig gone to nothing and feel what that makes a person feel. She had married him and kept his house for 30 years and had not known. The second strange thing was the knife. She found it in January in the shallow drawer of the carving bench, taped to the underside where a hand had to go looking for it on purpose. A worn rigging knife, older than the bench, its blade honed to a thin, bright sliver by 50 years of stropping, and taped beside it in a fold of oilcloth. A single slip of paper in the square, careful hand she had read on 30 years of feed tickets and Christmas tags. It did not say what it meant. It said only, "Set the eyes on the coin bird first, Ada." She sat down on the carving stool with the knife in her palm and the note on her knee and did not move for a long while. Emory did not tape notes to the bottoms of drawers. Emory said what he had to say across the supper table in 9 words and considered the matter closed. Somebody had hidden this, the way you hide a thing you mean to be found by one particular person. The kind who would know a rigging knife from a paring knife and understand that set the eyes was not truly an instruction about a bird at all. But Coin. Coin was her own name, the name she had carried up to the age of 40, the name on her father's stern and her father's stone. And there was no coin on that neck and never had been, and she could not think how a wooden bird on Emory Somers' shelf had come to wear it. She had left the loft for last. She turned the knife over once in the cold light, and put on her coat, and went to climb the ladder and find the bird that carried her father's name. She did not find the bird first. She found the book. It was in a dry tin on the loft sill, a canvas-covered ledger with one brass corner gone green, warped soft with river damp and handling. The kind sold in every chandlery on the shore in 1984. And when she opened it under the lantern, she did not at first understand what she was reading, because it looked like a gunning log. And Emory logged everything: dates, names, shelves. The first entry was dated in the winter of 1984, 2 years before he had ever found the nerve to speak to her at the Oyster House, and it read, "Number 1. Coin canvasback, off the one bird nobody would bid on at the landing sale the fall the water took her father. Kept on my shelf 16 years, the whole rig went for scrap, and she thinks it gone. Up in the loft, first shelf, by the window." Ada read it twice. Coin, her own name, and the bird was her father's bird, off the rig she had painted the eyes on as a young woman. The last good fall before the point took him, and the water took everything after. The boat and the rig sold off at the landing in the black year, when she was 22 and alone, and there was nothing to do but go up the county. And here it was. Or here its living copy was, carved off that one saved block by a quiet widower 2 years before he first spoke to her of all things about the run of the tide. He had never told her. 30 years, and he had never once told her that he was the man at the back of the landing sail, that he had saved a piece of her father before he had so much as learned her name. She held the book to her chest in the cold of the loft, and cried the way she had not cried at the graveside, and below her on the shelf stood the last birds he had set out, and that was only entry number 1. There were more than 200 to come. She read the rest of it that night by the stove, with the plastic ticking at the window and the tide working under the pilings, and it was like sitting across a table from a man confessing to a lifetime of a tenderness he had never once let anyone catch him at. Entry after entry, year over year, in the same square hand. Number 9. Tull black duck, off the last bird of the tull rig before the shed went into the creek. The family thought it long gone. 1 block saved. Number 41. Sowell redhead out of the poor house gunning rig when the county sold the marsh. Nobody on the crew would say what became of the birds, so I asked, and carried off the one they had thrown in the burn pile, and now it is safe. Number 90. Ruddy off a rig the highwaymen had already carted to the dump, got there the evening before the crusher. Number 106. A little sleeper of a make I can find in no book I own. Out of a fish house that had gone down into the marsh with the family's name, I have called it the Widgeon Gut, after the water, since the water is all the name left to it. On and on, 30 years of it. Landings and church shores and drowned fish houses and roadsides down the whole length of the river. Good working birds the collector's books had already written down as lost patterns, saved for the price of a tank of fuel because the world had decided the watermen who carved them and the families who gunned them were nobody, and every entry closed the same way. The same plain bearing, repeated like a man counting shelves in the dark, up in the loft, and a shelf, and a number. And threaded among the numbers, rarer, were the lines that were not rig-keeping at all. Under number 9. A whole winter of some gone watermen's evenings is in this bird, and they would have let the creek have it. That is the sickness of the world in one line. Under number 70. A. Asked tonight why my good coat smelled of paint and river of a Sunday. Told her the church rig. First lie in 11 years, and it was to keep a thing that was hers. Folded into the back of the book was a plan of the loft, every shelf drawn out square by square, every bird a numbered dot, and the last numbered entry, dated that September, a month before he passed, named no landing and no price. It read, number 211. Left blank, no eyes. The block off my own best cedar. It is for Ada to set the eyes. The way she set them on her father's rig the fall I first saw her on the dock, and had not yet the nerve to cross the water and speak. Up in the loft, first shelf, beside the coin, and beneath it, alone at the foot of the page, in a hand gone smaller and less sure, it is the loft, Ida. It was always the loft. Set the eyes on the coin bird, and then climb up and meet the rest of us. She did not read on. She climbed the ladder the next morning in the hard January light, with the rigging knife in her coat and the loft plan in her hand, and found it where the first entry said it would be. Up in the loft, first shelf, by the window, a canvas back carved by a knowing hand, its head turned just so. The little brass tag wired to its keel stamped. When she rubbed the green from it with her thumb, with the word coin and the number 1, she knew the set of its head against the gray window before ever she read the tag. It was her father's bird, or her father's bird made living again. The same proud, low canvas back that had ridden at the head of his rig every fall of her young years, that she had knelt on the cold dock and painted the eyes into with a hand the whole landing said had the gift for it. She stood a long while with it in both hands. Then she looked down the shelf and saw, at the near end, past the coin and its rig, one bird that was not like the others, a bird carved down smooth and fine and left utterly blank. No paint, no eyes, raw cedar the color of cream, with a slip of oilcloth tied at its keel, and she did not need to untie it to know what it said. She had set the eyes on her father's rig as a young woman, because she had the hand for it, and after the water took him, she had put the brushes down and never once picked them up again in 50 years. Because the family she came from was gone, and the hand seemed to have gone with it. And no one in the family she married into had ever thought her painting anything but a girl's old pastime not worth the mention. Ada sat down on an upturned bushel among 200 carved birds with her father's canvas back in one hand and the blank bird in the other, and let the whole of it arrive at once. None of this was an accident. Not the fish house, not the will, not the breath Wade let out through his nose. Her husband had left his son and his daughter everything that could be counted, and left her the one thing that could not. And then he had left her, at the very end of the book, a place to set her own hand. It took her the rest of that winter to work the whole loft, one shelf at a time, dusting each bird and checking its tag against the book. And the book was never once wrong. The tall black duck, older than the county courthouse. A redhead off a rig that had gone down into the marsh with a family whose landing lay under the new bypass. A little green-winged make whose only carved copy in the world, the note said, stood on that shelf, and nowhere else on earth. A battered old sleeper that no living carver but Emory had thought worth the saving. Off a fish house where the pilings had been pulled for their creosote and the family name taken off the chart. 2 shelves of confidence birds even, that a man gunned by the hundred and no collector ever kept. Carved. Because a rig is not a rig without them, and Emory would not send a family's rig back into the world half-made. The whole drowned river of vanished rigs the collector's books had given up for lost patterns, riding safe on the one loft the family had called good for nothing but muskrats. And the last of the numbered birds, the final handful on the first shelf, were not old and not rare, and not, to any dealer alive, worth the fuel to come and look at them. Number 209. A block off the church shore rig the whole chapel gunned from at the fall homecoming, and nobody kept up, carved so it would outlast the chapel. Number 210. The teague bird off Vernon's own home rig that his people would have let go, kept against his knowing. And number 211, the blank bird. Hers, the raw cedar canvasback, with no eyes and no name but her own, carved the last September of his life off his own best block, and left unfinished on purpose, set on the first shelf among the rarest birds on the shore, because in Emory's book her hand belonged in that same shelf. Her hand. The one small discarded piece of her own young life, remembered and carved and set living among lost patterns, worth a fortune, because in Emory's book it stood in the very same row. In the evenings of that winter she did the other reckoning, the kind Emory would have respected. She went down the book with a pencil and totaled 30 years of it. The fuel and the paint and the few dollars pressed on a waterman for a windfall block off a burn pile, and the whole of it, 30 years of saving the birds of a whole river, came to less than a good workboat, laid out a tank of fuel at a time by a man whose son priced the tear-down value of other people's crab houses for a living, and had gone through his father's accounts after the funeral like a man raking a creek bottom, and had found nothing gone. Because nothing was ever gone, it had all been entered, in a canvas book, in a cold loft, under the heading birds. She thought about the marriage that had been running quietly alongside the marriage she had known. The winter slack weeks down the guts, the careful few dollars, the one lie in 11 years, and it had been to guard a gift. She sat by the stove with her father's canvasback on the sill beside her, and understood that she had become the only widow she had ever heard of, who went looking for her husband's secret life, and found that the secret was her. It made the grief enormous, and it made it warm, and some nights that was the harder thing to carry, and she let it be hard, and kept the knife stropped and the shelves dusted, and the blank bird where she could see it. The letter was in the tin behind the book, folded small, in an envelope with one word on the face of it. Her name, in his hand. It was dated in September, the same week as the last entry, and it was not long, Emory was not long, on paper any more than aloud. Ida. It began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the will is read, and I expect Wade made his little noise, and I expect you signed it anyway, because you always did trust me a good deal further than a waterman who talks to wooden birds has any right to be trusted. So let me say it once in plain. They will take the front of the creek, and I am sorry for that, but the waterfront was never where I kept you. He told her the rest in half a page. In the flat voice she could hear coming off the paper, how he had watched her one fall on the landing dock when she was a young woman, kneeling in the cold to paint the eyes into her father's canvasbacks with a hand the whole river talked about, and how the water took her father that same winter and the rig went for scrap, how he had bought the one bird nobody would bid on and kept it on his shelf 16 years, meaning only to carve it up and give it back, and how he had lost his nerve every fall for 22 years. Because to give it back, he would have had to say how long he had carried that picture of her on the dock, and Emory would sooner have gone overboard in January. The two of them are provided for, the letter said, and they would have fought me for anything I left you that looked like money. They will never fight a soul for a mud flat and a leaking shanty. Ricketts has the wording tight, the ground and each and everything standing or stored upon it, That is you, Ada. That is 30 years of you. Keep them or send them out to every gunning family on the river. The book tells you what each one is and whose it was. Then, cramped into the last of the paper as though he had nearly run out of room for the thing he had waited a lifetime to set down, a decoy is a lie a man carves, so the living thing will come back and set down beside it. That was the whole of my trade. You were never the second wife, Ada. You were the block I cited every good bird in this loft against. Every true thing I ever carved, I carved to match you. It was signed the way he signed the Christmas tags. No closing word. Only the one letter, E, for 9 days she told no one. It was not strategy, whatever the family said of it afterward. It was more like the held quiet of a marsh under the bottom of the tide, when the whole flat lies waiting to see whether the water will come back. She kept her mornings in the loft, and every evening sat by the stove with the book and one bird's story at a time, reading the names. The Tulls. The Sowells. The poor house gunners the county had turned out of the marsh. They had nowhere else to gun. It came to her, somewhere in those days, that she was one of very few souls left alive who knew these rigs and these small histories had ever existed, and that whatever she did next, she must not do carelessly. It came to her more slowly that she was very likely not poor anymore, though the idea did not land where poverty had lived in her. She wrote, in her own hand, on the first clean line of the book, the date and one line. The loft dusted and every tag read. The coin bird stands, and the blank one waits. And on the 10th day she telephoned the one member of Emory Somers' family who had ever carried a cedar chest as though it mattered what was inside it, and said, "Cole, I need you to come down to the fish house, and bring that good camera of yours, and do not tell your father yet." Cole stood at the head of the loft ladder a long time without speaking, which for Cole was very nearly a medical event. He worked down the shelves twice, reading tags, his lips moving, and when he finally spoke it was to ask whether that date in the book meant what he thought it meant. Then Ada put the book in his hands and watched him meet his grandfather, the real one, the one none of them had known was living out here all those years, page by page, and watched him reach number 211, the blank bird with no eyes, and put the back of his hand to his mouth, because he had grown up on the family story that Ada used to paint, once, long ago, and had never once suspected there was a bird at the end of it, waiting on her. Cole cried the way his generation cries, laughing at himself with the water running down his face, and then became, all at once, extremely 28. This needed documenting. This needed an expert yesterday. And did Ada have the first idea what a single documented rig by a hand like that was worth to the collectors, let alone to a museum? Ada said she had some idea, but she let the boy run on, because the sound of one single member of that family being glad on her account was a thing she had not heard in so long that she wanted to stand in it a while, the way you stand in the first warm rain after a hard winter. They photographed all through a weekend, bird by bird and page by page, and sent it off to the Waterfowl Heritage Center 3 counties up the bay, whose name Ada had only ever seen on the back of a calendar. The answer came in 4 hours, on a Sunday, which Cole said meant everything. A curator named Corinne Ashby wrote that the photographs were either a very careful hoax or the most important private rig she had seen in 30 years in the field, and that either way she would like to drive down on Wednesday, and might she bring her calipers and a black light. She came in a mud-spattered wagon with a young assistant and a jeweler's loop on a cord around her neck. A spare, weathered woman somewhere past 60 who shook Ada's hand and then looked up at the fish house the way Ada had taught herself to look at it over the winter. Not at the ruin of the pilings, but up, toward the loft under the caved roof. What went on up those shelves over the next 6 hours had the shape of a chapel service. Long silences, sudden low words, a hand laid flat on an old cedar back. At a squat little sleeper on the 3rd shelf, Corinne Ashby stopped speaking altogether for the better part of 5 minutes. At the green-winged make, whose only carved copy in the world stood on that shelf, she set her loupe to the paint and the tool marks and said, half to herself, that the books had buried this pattern 30 years ago, and that whoever had carved it had known exactly what he was holding. But it was the book that undid her, the way it had undone Ada. Provenance, she explained to Cole, who was filming everything, was the whole game and the missing half of the work. The shore was full of orphaned old birds, beautiful and mute, their makers and their home rigs lost past recovering. What was almost never found was not the bird but the record, and here was a living collection in which every carving carried a date, a home rig, a family, and a chain of keeping in one steady hand. Collectors will pay for a rare bird, she said. A museum can build 30 years of work on the paper. This is both, and in 30 years I have never once seen both. As to money, she was a curator and not a dealer. But she would not insult them by being coy. A single documented bird of a lost pattern was worth more to the right collection than the buildable frontage up the creek. Not at auction, but as the anchor of a hall that would carry these families' names for good. The rig entire, with its book, was a museum as it stood, and there were trusts that would fund the keeping of such a place, and the widow who kept it, for the rest of her natural life. Then she came to the last of the first shelf, the church shore bird, the teague bird, and the blank canvas back with no eyes, and checked each against its page, and looked up at Ada with an expression that had nothing professional left in it. And this one, she said, turning the raw cedar bird in the light. Ada said that one was not worth anything to anybody. Corinne Ashby looked back down at the page where a man had written it is for Ada to set the eyes, the way she set them on her father's rig the fall I first saw her on the dock, and said, quietly, that she would have to disagree, and that with Ada's leave, the whole collection would be dedicated on it. The weeks that followed had a way of making up the neck's mind for it, landing by landing, pew by pew. The Crab House, which in November had let Wade's every rotten plank joke pass without a word, developed a memory. Vernon told the church rig story to anyone who tied up beside him. The chapel circle told no stories at all, which on that shore is the loudest thing a group of women can do. Dana telephoned once, in April, a long call that opened with concern for how Ada was managing out there alone on the marsh, and worked its way, by degrees in Dana's bright administrative voice, around to how families really ought not let a thing like this reach a courtroom, and how surely there was a figure that would make sense to everyone. Ada listened to the whole of it, sitting on the fish house step with the receiver, watching the light move down the shelves through the loft window. Then she said she agreed entirely that it should never have come near a courtroom, and let the silence do its work, and wished Dana a good evening. She was not proud of how much she enjoyed it. The story had gotten out the way stories get out on a shore county, a mud-spattered wagon down the Shell Road twice, a mailboat man with a long memory and a stool at the Crab House, a chapel woman sworn to secrecy, and then her sister. By March, it had reached the county weekly, which sent a young reporter who wrote it up fairly, and could not resist the headline. Widow's condemned fish house hides a fortune in lost decoys, and the county weekly was online, and online reached the suburbs, and reached the marina office where Wade kept his mornings, and on the first mild Sunday in April, Wade's truck came down the Shell Road for the first time since the funeral. Ada watched it come from the fish house step and put the coffee on, because some habits carry the weight of a whole life. Wade was expansive at the door, cap actually in his hands, full of how about that, and Dad always was a deep one, and Ada let him get all the way to the thing he had driven down the neck to say, which was that, of course, legally speaking, those birds were something of a gray area. Were they not? Carved as part of the water business, really. Part of the estate proper, and naturally the family would want to see it all handled fair. The whole of it in the tone of a man doing her a kindness she was too old to follow. Ada poured his coffee and said the will read the ground and each and everything standing or stored upon it, of whatever kind and value. Wade smiled the marina closing smile and said that wills could be read a good many ways. Ada said that then she expected they would have it read the one more way, and thanked him for coming, and stood in the door while he backed the truck around and noticed that her hands were steady, and thought, he does not know about the letter. Emory, you even saw the coffee coming. The petition itself asked the county court to construe the will, to rule that a thing stored upon a condemned fish house meant the rotted netting and the crab pot lumber a waterman leaves behind, as any reasonable man would naturally mean, and could not have been intended to carry a documented decoy rig worth more than the frontage below it. And, in the alternative, Wade and Dana raised the possibility, delicately, and then not delicately at all, that the birds had been carved and set out on the shelves after the will was signed, or even after Emory was gone. That last suggestion did what nothing since the funeral had managed to do. It made Ada Somers angry. Cole offered to testify against his own father before anyone had asked him to. Corinne Ashby wrote an affidavit on the trust's letterhead, dating the carvings by the oxidation of the old lead paint, the honest wear on the keels where hands and gunwales had rubbed them, the tight-age checks opened in the cedar, the very cake of dust and salt settled into the tool marks, 30 years of it settled and past faking. And J.T. Ricketts, who had waited 40 years to be interesting, telephoned Ada on a Tuesday evening and told her that Emory had left instructions for exactly this weather, a sealed copy of the letter in the office safe, and Ricketts's own file memorandum dated 3 years back, in which Emory Somers had directed the phrase each and everything standing or stored upon it into the will. And, when Ricketts had remarked that it was unusual language for a mudflat, had answered, Ricketts read it off the memo over the telephone, dry as a docket, that the only things I own worth a fight are up in that loft, and the words had best hold, because my son reads a will the way he reads a waterfront. Ada laughed until she had to sit down on the cot. It was the first time she had laughed at something Emory said since October, and, the way things were tending, it would not be the last. The hearing was set for a bright morning in May, in the courtroom on the second floor of the county building, a room with tall windows and a radiator that knocked like a fist. Ada wore the good dress she had married him in, because it still fit, and because she was finished apologizing for sentiment. She had expected to sit alone with her lawyer, and she did not sit alone in any way that counted. The gallery behind her filled, row by row, with the chapel circle 6 strong, with Vernon Teague in a necktie the color of a spring marsh, with 2 watermen whose grandfather's rigs Emory had carved back from a single battered bird, come to sit for the man who had done it, and with Cole, who took a seat on Ada's side of the aisle in full view of his father, and did not once look away from the front of the room. Wade and Dana sat with their hired lawyers and did not turn around. Ada understood, looking at the backs of their necks, that whatever the judge found, something had already been settled in that room, in the seating of it, the way these things are settled in chapels and crab houses and shore counties, and that it had not been settled their way. The morning went the way Ricketts had promised, because the men who write a thing down at the time will beat the men who only remember it later. The hired lawyers argued that no reasonable waterman means a fortune in rare birds when he says whatever is stored in a rotten shanty, that the language was boilerplate, that fairness could not abide a windfall. Then, Ricketts took the stand, 78 years old with 40 years of Emory Somers' paper in a banker's box, and read his own memorandum into the record. The phrase the client had asked for, of whatever kind and value, the client's stated reason, the only things I own worth a fight, are up in that loft, the date, 3 years before Emory passed. Vernon Teague called for 10 minutes, told the court about 30 years of slack winter weeks down the guts. Pay refused, and said a man who had kept the whole river's rigs riding to the season did not lose track of what he owned. Corinne Ashby testified to the oxidation of the paint and the settled dust in the tool marks, and took apart the notion that anyone had carved and aged 200 birds on a shelf overnight with the weary exactness of a woman marking a poor examination. And then Ada's lawyer read the letter. She read it slowly, into a courtroom gone so still the radiator sounded rude. "They will take the front of the creek, and I am sorry for that, but the waterfront was never where I kept you," and Ada watched the court reporter's hands, because she could not watch anything else in the room, and when the reading reached the last lines, the block he cited every good bird against, one of the chapel women behind her made a small broken sound, and the judge did not gavel it. And at the far table Dana put her face in her hands, and Ada was surprised to find she took no pleasure in it. Almost none. She was a truthful woman, even about herself. The judge ruled from the bench, which the young lawyer whispered was a rare thing. He said the language of the will was not ambiguous, and that even were it ambiguous, the evidence outside it, the memorandum, the church rig, the oxidation and the wear, the book and the maker's own letter, settled the maker's intent past any honest doubt. Emory Somers had known to the bird what stood in his loft, had chosen his words with care to carry it there, and had trusted the court to read plain English plainly, a trust the court saw no reason to disappoint. The petition was denied. Costs to the petitioners. He was quiet a moment, and then, in the voice a judge keeps for the one human sentence he permits himself, he said that in 26 years on the bench he had construed a great many wills, and that this was the first he had ever read that was also, so far as he could tell, a love letter with a boat's measurements in it, and he wished the widow joy of her marriage. In the corridor afterward, Wade came at her sideways through the crowd, his face working at something, and what finally came out of it was that he had not known his father had it in him. Ada looked a long moment at her husband's son, and found she had no wish left to wound him, which was a verdict of its own. "He had it in him the whole time," she said. "You only ever worked the front of the creek. You never once climbed the loft." And she shook his hand, because Emory would have wanted it done, and went down the courthouse stairs into the May light, with the chapel women around her, like an honor guard. The dedication was held at the fish house that autumn, a year almost to the day from the funeral, with the marsh gone bronze, and the whole river turned out to see it. Corinne Ashby had fought her own board over the name and won, so the sign they set at the head of the walk said what the book was: The Widow's Ledger, 30 Years of the River's Lost Rigs. The book itself lay first, open under glass in the mended fish house, to the page for number 1, the coin canvas back, and the card beside it told the story straight, because no curator could improve on it. The great old rigs stood along the loft shelves with their families and their home guts lettered large on cedar tags at their keels, exactly as the letter had ordered, the tull off the drowned shed, the pattern the books had buried, the poor house redhead, every landing the book could name. Carvers came, and students, and gunning families by the boatload from 4 counties, and were given, each, a block off Emory's own stock to carry home and rig, and the head of the first shelf held 3 birds of no market value at all: the church shore bird, the teague bird, and the blank canvasback, each with its page enlarged on a tag above it, and the trust's own count showed what Corinne Ashby had known it would. People walked briskly enough past the rarest bird on the shore, and stood the longest, and went the quietest, under the raw cedar one with no eyes and a woman's name on its keel. Otta sold nothing that first year but a few blocks of cedar, and the little it brought re-roofed the fish house, which a neckman did at cost, for the story of it. The rest she let the trust keep, on the one condition that the family's names stayed large. She was not rich the way the county weekly had promised. She was something the weekly had no column to print. She stayed on the marsh. Wade's lawyers in the summer sent a stiff, careful letter offering to sell her back the house at appraisal, and she declined by return post, with real thanks, because the offer meant Cole was working on him. But the truth was the house had never been where Emory kept her either, and she knew now where she lived. She kept the fish house, and she kept the loft, and taught Cole on second Saturdays how to take a battered old block off a failing rig and carve it living again. The chapel circle moved their Tuesdays out to the fish house, 6 women out over the water, all keeping the same slow slack. And now and then a young person came down the neck who wanted to know how a thing that had been given up for lost could be made to ride again, and Ada showed them, because Emory's book had always been very clear about what things were for. She set out a rack of cedar blocks below the loft ladder and rough carved rig of her own, so that anyone who came down the water with the name of a family and the memory of a bird could go back up it with a living block to rig. And the giving Emory had done in the dark she did now in the plain light of day, with both their names on it, and thought he would not have minded that one change to his trade. And on a winter evening in the fish house, with the stove ticking and her father's canvasback riding the sill in the lamplight, Ada took down the blank bird at last and opened the old coffee can of brushes the family had never thought worth a second look, and with the hand they had written off 50 years before, steadied it and set the eyes, a coin eye that looks back at you, and then put on her reading glasses, opened the canvas book to the first clean line, and wrote in her own steady hand, number 212. Coin canvasback, eyes set true, top of the first shelf, beside her father's. Home, set this evening, and every winter after, by the one it was carved for. Not for sale, not now, not ever, and this time the whole river knows what it is worth. She looked at the page a while. Then she added the last line, the one the whole book had been waiting on, and closed the cover over it. Kept in the loft. Still riding her time. Thank you for staying to the end of Ada's story. Stories like this one only keep their season when someone stays for the whole slow length of them, the way Emory stayed, and the way you just did. Now it is your turn to add a line to the ledger. Somewhere in your life there was a person like him, someone whose love did its quiet work out of sight, in a workshop or a garden or a fish house or a savings book, someone you did not fully read until the years let the light come in sideways. Tell us about them in the comments. Tell us their name and the quiet thing they did. Because a name written down is a name kept, and this channel is, in the end, a ledger too, and we read every entry. If this story earned it, share it with one person who needs reminding that being overlooked is not the same as being unloved. And if you would like more stories of the ones a family wrote off, climbing the one loft nobody thought to cross the water for, subscribe to the Widow's Ledger and tap the bell so the next one finds you. Until then, look after the quiet ones. And every so often, go and set the eyes on the old bird.